So yeah, who tends to come to you for EB-1A help?
There are a lot of different types of EB1 profiles and cases, and everyone kind of falls under maybe 5 different types. I can run through them really quickly. The first is the scholar or researcher, and this can include professors, it can include academic researchers, and it can even include industry researchers as well. And they tend to go for a set of criteria like leading or critical role, original contributions, authorship of scholarly articles, and judge of the work of others. All 4 of those criteria work really, really well together. And so for that kind of profile, I'm usually expecting to evaluate those criteria, and then any extras are a bonus. Usually the person in this profile needs to have some major research accomplishment, so some accomplishment that's been either highly cited or commented on in the public eye. That's something that's really exciting for the future, and that has already been in use and in commentary. Another profile that I work a lot with is what I call the industry profile. And this is usually senior managers or executives, any size company really. That's from like the top 10 companies in the US to a tiny, tiny little startup company to everything in between. But they also kind of fit the same general profile where they're claiming leading or critical role, high salary, and then we're looking at some combination of other criteria as well. So some of them can claim original contributions, some of them can claim media attention, some can claim memberships, and then some can also claim original contributions. So yeah. So they have the leading critical role and high salary locked down, and at that point we're just trying to figure out what else can add to their profile. The key hurdle that these people have to overcome is they have to show that they are extraordinary in some way that is recognized. So it can't just be like moving up in the company ranks and getting accolades that way, or having a top level job at a prestigious company. They have to show impact to the field overall. They have to show that they have sustained acclaim at the national or international level in that field. So that's often what I'm talking with the industry profile people about. Then I have the entrepreneur profile. And those are people who have started their own company. It can be in any stage. Usually if they have received some kind of significant funding, or alternatively have significant revenue and profit and a track record of that, then they can fit into these kind of alternative criteria. Obviously we claim leading or critical role. A lot of times we can claim high salary, especially if the company has received significant funding, or if they've had huge profits such that the executive or the founder is compensated highly. And then we also claim original contributions, and a lot of times we're claiming that the contribution is the establishment of the company itself. And then we show what that company is doing and how they're filling a really important need in the market. And then a lot of these founders can also meet the media criterion, and then sometimes others as well. It's a really cool profile to work with. Those are really unique cases. And those cases, the main hurdle is all about showing impact. They need to show that their company, which they have founded, has had real, measurable, sustained impact on the field. Another profile that I get a lot is what I call the tinkerer. They have kind of like little bits of everything here and there, and they've actually worked across a wide variety of fields and have a lot of accolades. And they can meet any number of criteria. Like I'm often claiming awards, which I rarely claim in other profiles, but I'm claiming awards, media attention, memberships, and all kinds of things. But it's hard to claim original contributions or leading role. These cases are really difficult because we need to find some kind of anchor criterion. Like we need to define the thing that makes them extraordinary. And when they have a bunch of disparate and disconnected things, that can be really difficult. So a lot of times I'm working on how to tell a cohesive story and how to build that narrative. And I'm also working with them a little bit to either build on or get something else that they can use as that anchor criterion. It's really difficult to get an EB1 case approved if you can't claim the leading role or original contributions criteria. I've done it, but it's really, really, really difficult. And then the fifth profile is the person who's just starting out, where sometimes it's a PhD student, sometimes it's even a master's student, where maybe they have a few years of work experience, but they weren't targeting the EB-1 originally, and they're coming to me at a time where they're just starting to build their profile. And for these cases, the main hurdle is getting extraordinary ability because you're essentially building that from the ground up. Most of these people do not have anything in their profile currently that makes them extraordinary. So we're usually looking at a 2 to 3 year timeline minimum, sometimes like even 5 or 6 years down the road for a lot of Indian nationals. And we're just trying to figure out what are the key things that can be targeted and how to leverage a natural 5-year career plan to dovetail with the EB-1 and make the person qualified in the future. So yeah, those are the profiles that I see. I'm happy to work with anyone in those profiles. They all have very interesting, unique cases, which is why I like the EB-1 practice.
For someone who falls under the fifth profile, so 2 to 3 years, how can they know if they've done something that then proves that they are extraordinary? Because I see this question all the time. It's like, what does extraordinary mean? How do I know what I'm doing? Because I guess doing something extraordinary doesn't take like a couple of weeks. So how do you know if you're on the right track? Is what I see a lot of people asking.
Yeah, so the definition of extraordinary is a bit of a catch-22 because you have to meet these criteria, but then on top of that, you have to show that you are extraordinary. Criteria are supposed to show you're extraordinary, but then you have to meet this final merits, and it kind of goes in a circle where the term extraordinary ability is not actually defined as a separate thing in the law. So you have to kind of adopt a reasonable person standard where yes, you do have to check 3 criteria off the list, and you should talk with someone, probably an attorney, who can guide you on which criteria are going to be the most strategic for your case. But even though you're checking those criteria off the list, you should ask yourself, would a normal person in my field think that the accolades or recognition that I'm getting is high level? Would they be envious of it? Would they think that I am far above average just by getting this recognition and this accolades? And I emphasize recognition and accolades a lot because extraordinary ability is not just about doing a technical thing. It's not about making that contribution itself. It's not about being the brains behind the operation. It is about the recognition that you receive for it. So this is why I tell people to target that media criterion, even though it's hard to win, and even though a lot of people look on it with a skeptical eye. Because if you are working through your career with the idea that you want media attention, you want that recognition for what you have done, I think you are in a better mindset to build that EB-1 case. But yeah, look at it as a reasonable person in your field. Ask your colleagues, is this cool? Is this interesting? Think about the people who are receiving similar recognition, similar awards, similar invitations, and ask yourself if you think that group of people is the top. And doing all of that will help guide you through your career. Unfortunately, it's not a clearly defined thing. So you may have to think about this quite often as you're going through your career and kind of consistently reevaluate and then see how your profile is coming together as a whole as well.
So is it possible to be in a niche field and do something in that field that might not rise to the level of international acclaim, but still be considered extraordinary, but within your niche field and maybe slightly beyond that?
Yeah. So you don't necessarily need international acclaim, but you do need national acclaim, which is kind of interesting because there are big countries and small countries. And national acclaim, for example, in China will mean that you are recognized as a top expert by millions of people. National acclaim in Luxembourg might mean that you're recognized by even just a few hundred people, especially if you're in a very niche field. Like if you're a top finance expert in this particular tax transfer thing. I probably even said that wrong because it's not my niche. Yeah, so it's hard to build the argument because you have to define that for USCIS. You have to tell USCIS why this is national acclaim or why it's international acclaim. But national acclaim is enough. So if that person in Luxembourg says they have national acclaim for being the top person at this particular bank for this particular finance thing, they can probably pass that credential. And then if they meet all three criteria and have satisfied USCIS as far as that, USCIS should approve that case. Even if they're denying a similar case from, a top finance expert in China who can't demonstrate that they have national acclaim, even though they've checked off that same list of criteria. So that's the interesting thing about it. USCIS and the US government generally tend to care more about things on a country level than actual impact on people.
Can you talk about an example of someone who started building their profile as a junior professional and were able to do a couple of things even while having a full-time job that allowed them to build a profile in 2 to 3 years and then even qualify?
Yeah, I worked with a client recently who was a graduate of a master's program. And he went into a very particular niche field and actually did a whole startup. He founded a startup in his home country. And then he came to the US to study for his master's degree, his second master's degree. And then while his startup was running, because he had fully established it and operated it there, he focused most of his attention on then meeting the EB-1 criteria specifically. So he applied for a bunch of national level awards. He also made sure that he hired a PR agency and got in a bunch of media outlets. Some were good and some were not, but he at least got some media attention there. He did a lot of volunteer judging. So that was both judging in his particular field that he had founded his startup in, but also judging related to a lot of allied fields, so just STEM in general. And then he also applied to be a member of certain associations as well. So by the time he graduated, we were able to kind of put everything together, and we were able to kind of define his founding of this very successful startup, which by that point had branched internationally and had multiple different franchises. We were able to show that that was the anchor. His leading or critical role for the startup was the anchor criteria. That was what made him super extraordinary. And then show how he met these criteria all in his particular field of expertise. So it's definitely possible, but you do have to be extraordinary to do that. Like, not everyone is going to be able to start a company, make sure it's super successful, and then do their master's and get all these accolades and all of that. It is possible if that's something that you feel is within you and that you want to put that work in. I will say that this particular client was very regimented and very goal-driven, where every day he was working towards something that boosted his EB-1 profile.
So what's a software engineer, especially non-startup software engineer, what does that look like for someone who is a junior software engineer who one day wants to qualify for EB-1A but still wants to work in the industry? Is that research? Is that having like some special project?
You can still be a software engineer and qualify. You need to be doing something very unique and particular at your company, or you need to be able to show that you've made some original contribution, maybe through open source software publishing, or maybe through the discovery or the patenting or something else where you are clearly designated as the innovator or the owner of something that has been influential out in the market or for other companies or for nonprofits or something like that. So if you want to be a software engineer when you apply for EB-1, I would recommend either claiming that leading or critical role or claiming that you have an original contribution. From that point, if that has been significantly impactful and you meet those other criteria, you should be able to claim that you're a top software engineer. But if you are kind of just going along with normal company initiatives and rising in the ranks, and you don't have anything like super original or innovative to claim is yours particularly, you may have to wait until you are a principal software engineer or until you've risen into a managerial or executive role before you can actually qualify for the EB-1. Because at that point, you're kind of claiming a separate set of criteria where you're relying more on your level of experience, your high salary at that point, and then a few other accolades or criteria.
What would you claim if at that level then, as let's say you do rise to the level of executive or principal software engineer, how would you then claim extraordinary ability on the basis of those achievements?
Yep, so probably you would claim leading role and high salary. You should also at that point be able to find some judging opportunities that will fulfill the judge role, like judging hackathons or judging award ceremonies or weighing in on some kind of conference or regulatory committee for best practices or other guides for the industry. And then at that point, you should also target other criteria. I think it doesn't really matter which ones you target, as long as you have one or two additional criteria to claim. And I will say for scholars and researchers, I am comfortable a lot claiming only 3 criteria. For industry professionals, though, I normally do recommend that people have 4 or 5. I've received some approvals when we only claim 3, but those are for top executives, like founder, president of company with tens of millions in revenue or hundreds of millions, and then significant profit sustained over a decade or so. So if you're not quite at that level, I think having 4 or 5 criteria is usually the right strategy.
So at that point, your proof of extraordinary ability is rising to that level, or do you still need to find something else?
It can be rising to that level, especially if you're at a well-known company. Or even if not at a well-known company, a company that you can describe in the record as having a very particular niche that is important. And sometimes this is where I will bring in kind of a national interest argument, even though that's not part of the EB-1. But if you have a really niche company that's not well known, and you can demonstrate that they're doing something that's very significant for US national interests, that can be very powerful.
So that would be judged, that would be weighed the same as having your own startup that has grown to an international scale, rising to the level of executive or principal software engineer.
And sometimes, honestly, it's even better than having your own startup. For startups, you really do need a level of funding and recognition in order to make the EB-1 case work. If you have just risen within a company and that company fulfills a really important niche in the market, you do have a leg up on most startups, where maybe your case is even stronger. A lot of people think that industry EB-1s are all about startups, and they're actually not. It is an angle that can be argued, so startup cases are good. But a lot of industry people qualify even if they're just working at companies and have no entrepreneurial mindset or desire in the future.
So, for example, the president of a mid-sized company in logistics could be considered, that in itself could be considered as proof of extraordinary ability?
I would definitely argue that, yes. I mean, they do also have to meet the other criteria, but it's a great anchoring factor for the case, especially if they have risen to that level, and especially if they've received recognition in the logistics industry from their peers. So yeah, that's definitely a profile that's well worth considering for EB-1.
What if it's a new field that just started in the last few years? Actually, what have you seen in the AI space, given that it's only...
Yeah. Yeah, I remember working on my first AI case back in 2014 or something like that. And of course, we didn't call it AI at that point in time, but thinking back on it, it was all of the research that's going into the large language model technologies today. And I remember that being kind of a new field, at least for me at that point in time, where we had to bring in a lot of research papers to define the field and tell USCIS why it was important. And it's kind of crazy to think about. Like back in 2014, AI didn't really exist as a field that people were working in the US, but it was kind of true. Um, at least it was a very small field, a very niche field, and not one that people were talking about. And then transport over to today, to 2024, 10 years later. And now I'm defining subfields of AI. We were doing very, very niche specialties. And some of these subfields are so new that they didn't exist even 3 years ago. So defining the field that way is fine. USCIS should be prepared to adjudicate petitions, knowing that our knowledge across the world is always changing and growing and evolving. And I haven't had any issues with defining really new niche fields for them. It just sometimes takes a little bit more explanation so that if it's not something they've heard about before, we will have done the work to kind of explain what it is and why it's important.
If you're a pioneer of, let's say you're the one who's defining a new field within an existing field, is doing that work in itself considered a form of extraordinary ability? Because you were the one?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So the case I worked back in 2014, we were arguing that the person had essentially opened up a new field of inquiry and established a new subspecialty within the field. I forget what it was or how we defined it, but I do remember doing that research and figuring out that he was one of the leading figures in his country that had been one of the first to actually do research in a particular area. And it did factor in somehow to AI. I don't remember the details of the case right now.
So rising to a high level is considered a form of extraordinary ability, starting your own venture. What else can be considered extraordinary ability that people don't really think of? Because I think it's the term extraordinary ability that trips up most people. Maybe it's because they're in a... every day they see lots of the same people, because I guess if you're the president of a company, you probably see lots of other presidents of companies.
Yeah.
So you don't really think of that. Your definition of extraordinary is like, I don't know, CEO of like a multinational, something like that. So
Yeah.
what's something else that people don't really consider extraordinary, or based on their interpretation of that term, that USCIS does consider to meet that extraordinary ability standard?
Anytime you can argue that you're top 1% of anything, that's extraordinary ability. You should definitely present that to the attorney that you're consulting with. Hard numbers like that work really, really well, especially if you can present that analysis or comparison to USCIS. Automatically presidents of companies should probably qualify because not everyone is going to rise to be the president of their company. But on its own, it won't be it could be the deciding factor of the case. On its own, it won't win the case. You also have to meet the criteria. That's the thing. Let me think. The gold standard for EB-1, where it's clear proof of extraordinary ability and you don't even need to do a criteria analysis, would be winning something like the Nobel Prize or the Pulitzer Prize or an Oscar or something like that, or Olympic medal. You can just present that evidence to USCIS and they will say, yes, you are extraordinary. And that's it. USCIS kind of introduced the criteria to help evaluate anyone who doesn't have that automatically approvable case. So when I say that you need something that makes you extraordinary, that's where the whole inquiry gets to be a little bit circular. Because USCIS has said these top awards will make you extraordinary. They haven't really defined anything else. There are a lot of attorneys who think this whole final merits analysis thing or the overall look is actually contrary to the law and should not be USCIS's focus. And I do kind of agree with them because of the way the law is set up, where it says you can either have these things that automatically make you extraordinary or you can meet 3 criteria. Yeah, so it's not a clear-cut answer. It's really difficult to determine, and you will get a lot of different opinions. So when evaluating your profile for EB-1A, definitely talk to several different attorneys. Talk to other people in your field and ask, how does my profile look? Do you think this is extraordinary? And see what else you can explore, see how strong you think your case is, and get that information first before presenting the argument to USCIS.
So is it possible to, let's say you're one level below, I don't know, like president or vice president of a company, if you switch companies to get that role, does USCIS see that as less than rising to that same level at your company?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's a little different if you founded the company. Like founder and president looks really, really good, especially if the company is successful. But if you career hop, switching companies every few years and are showing a pattern of rising your career, that's certainly sufficient.